So we're going to continue with our discussion of Judaism and Christianity. We've seen how they have this kind of shared root and shared history, and I started last time delving a little bit into the kind of the breakup around the end of the kind of BC, 100 to BC to about the 1st century AD. And these different schools of Jewish thought. And there is this sense in which you have to understand Jesus is a Jew. The early apostles are a Jew. Paul, one of the most formative proclaimers, teachers, theologians of Christianity, is a Jew's Jew. This isn't, we don't always think of it, we don't always realize that when we talk about Judaism and Christianity, but it starts as this discussion over what does it mean to be Jewish? Who has the kind of true understanding of the continuation of this story of God and his people? This God who we talked about, who is, this holy other God, this amazing God who is also a present in history God, who is a God who is perfect and yes, engaged with humanity and with history, right? That God, and how do we properly continue his worship? How does that work? And that divide is solidified in 70 AD pretty much when the temple is destroyed. Though solidified may sound too harsh, there's still interaction between Judaism and Christianity in some sense to this day, right? There's interaction and discussion ongoing between Jews and Christians and Jewish thinkers and Christian thinkers. And so there is influence between the two. But in the early years, it's this discussion over who is continuing truly and rightly the faith of Abraham, the faith of Moses, the law. How does that work? And so we're getting more at that root this time. What does it mean to be the people of God? Who are the true people of God? This is the persistent question. It'll come in with Islam as well, but we won't get into that today. So what we have today as traditional Judaism, this is from a Jewish website, and the writer says, is a religion not in the sense of a faith commitment, but in the orthoprax, correct practice, sense of a culture and a way of life of the Jewish people. Not faith in God nor any other faith commitment defines one as a Jew. This is difficult often for us as people with familiarity with the Western religious tradition, right? The pagans had gods they were devoted to. When we look at the Old Testament, it's very much an issue of your devotion to God. And the kind of Christian underpinnings to Western society, even though they've been largely rejected, they're still there, this kind of underlying idea that when you're religious, it has to do with your belief in a God, which is often why Buddhism is so hard for us to understand and grasp. But for the Jews, there's a variety, right? There are those who define themselves as secular. We would never think of a secular Christian, typically. There are in Judaism different streams, right? And different approaches within each stream. But what defines one as a Jew is being born to a Jewish mother or having converted. And what unites Jews is not faith commitment, but being part of the people with a shared history, language, land, and culture or way of life. This is integral to understanding modern Judaism. And this early period of division is what this comes out of. How do you define yourself truly as a Jew? If you're Jewish, you're the people of God. This is the big question. The other thing to keep in mind is traditional Judaism of today as a religion, and this is from that same web source, is based not only on the whole Hebrew Scriptures, on the Bible, but upon the Jewish rabbinic tradition. And the foundation of the Jewish rabbinic tradition is the Talmud. Now, what is the Talmud? Within Jewish scriptures, we have the Torah, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Gemara, and Midrash. These terms, right? What do all these mean? You may have heard some of them, you may have heard none of them. You should have at least heard Torah, right? We've talked about the Torah, which technically is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, or what Christians refer to as the Old Testament. Right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. This is the core of the Torah, but in kind of typical parlance, the Torah often refers to the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures, because it's all rooted in those first 5 books. But this would include the prophets, the Psalms, the wisdom literature, those kind of more historical books. Those, from a Jewish context, those historical books like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, Joshua, Judges, those are called the former prophets, and what most kind of Christian-based approaches to the Scriptures call those histories. The Jews call those the former prophets, and then what most Christian-based approaches to the Scriptures call prophets. The Jewish reference is the latter prophets. So, but all of that, right? All those books together, those are referred to often as the Torah. These are the written law of God, the written Scriptures, the things that were passed down and canonized, that were held as canonical. The Mishnah is something that you may have heard of, is less familiar. The Mishnah, this is from another Jewish conservative website. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and conveyed to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. One of the remnants of the Great Assembly used to say, the world stands on 3 things: the Torah, on the service of God, and on the acts of loving kindness, is from the ethics of the Father. But while the world stands on that, the understanding of the Torah, we mentioned this a little bit last time, is totally rooted in the Mishnahs, which are the idea as Moses received this oral Torah on Sinai, along with the written Torah, right? So God gave him the written laws, and then he gave them these oral teachings, and Moses passed those on. And so that's when we talked about a little bit last time, the Great Assembly compiled these oral teachings into writing to explain the Torah. That's what the Mishnah means. So you have these, the Torah, the Mishnah is understood from the Jewish context as the oral tradition passed down from Moses that he received from God. The Talmud is the combination in a book of the Torah, the Mishnah, and what we call Gemara. Gemara are commentaries on it. If you've heard the term Midrash, Midrash means like a teaching. So within the Torah, there's a Midrash on some question within marriage, right? So a Midrash is a word for a specific teaching dealing with a specific subject. But the Talmud consists of portions of the Torah surrounded by the Mishnah and surrounded by Gemara. That's what I mean. So you have central this portion of the Torah, and surrounding it are the Mishnahs, the oral tradition passed down and codified by the Great Assembly that we mentioned last week, right? That's in that timeline. So these Mishnah that are codified, written down by the Great Assembly, are then commented on the further outer ring of this writing by Gemara, which are the commentaries, along in the margins especially, of later rabbis. Such and such rabbi said this about it, such and such rabbi said that about it. It's further explanation. And Talmud and Torah study are to be engaged in conversation. It's not like a private thing. So it's in debate. The Torah itself is in debate and discussion and reference back to other elders. And this will be, you'll see, as a point of break between Jesus and early Jewish, or these late antiquity, these Jewish teachers, the rabbis of his time. Is people will say, well, he speaks with authority, not like the rabbis. What do they mean? Well, the rabbis, when asked a question, would say, well, in this, this midrash here, Hillel says this, Shammai says this rabbi said that, and you would get this kind of ongoing discussion. Whereas Jesus had this sort of sense of going back to the Torah directly. He often conflicted with Pharisees over, right, you negate the law of God with the teachings of the elders, right? That was Jesus' often prophetic critique of the teachers of his day. So when we understand this history, first we need to understand it as that inter-Jewish dialogue and discussion and critique, prophetic critique of this idea of these Mishnahs, this oral tradition, which was written down just, a couple hundred years before Jesus, and all this commentary. Obviously, they didn't have the written Talmud like this, because the Talmud, it comes from between 100 and 500 AD, or the Common Era. That time period is when the Talmud is really compiled and put together. But the ideas that are founding of it, the Mishnahs that are passed on, these things come from the Great Assembly about 250 or so years before Jesus' time. So this is part of the nature of modern Judaism. It's part of the break between modern Judaism and Christianity. Is how do you understand the scriptures? How do you understand the Torah? And for the Jews, it relates to these Mishnah, to these commentaries from the rabbis in this ongoing discussion. Right, so this is what's going on during this time period. We see about 30 or so years before Jesus, these two great teachers, Hillel and Shammai, these are still referenced, right? These are still kind of some of the main commenters referenced to this day within modern Judaism. Preference is given to Hillel, but the two schools were often in dispute. And so this is the type of discussion that would go on. You see here about a bride. And here again you see, right, in the Talmud, a heavenly voice declared the words of both schools are the words of the living God, but the law follows the ruling of the school of Hillel. So they're both from God, but there's a debate. And this is an interesting aspect of Hebrew culture and understanding of Scripture. Think about Abraham in Genesis, kind of debates or bargains with God over Sodom and Gomorrah. Moses debates with God on Mount Sinai for the sake of the people. You see in one story that we didn't read, Joshua wrestles, not Joshua, Jacob wrestles with the Lord as he's returning from his father-in-law's house. The book of Job, which is part of the Jewish wisdom literature, wrestles with God over why is there suffering for those who do right, right? What's in a sense, why do bad things happen to good people? And there's this wrestling with God, and there's not a real clear answer. It's just more questions. So this questioning, this wrestling, this is part of this Jewish culture, and that transcends into, it moves into Christian understanding as well. It's not that there's no wrestling with God in the Christian sense, but this becomes rather central to the way that the Jews approach Scripture. If you ever watch videos of schools of the Talmud, you'll see always two together over the writing. and debating, ongoing, reading together, talking together. So this is part and parcel of the development of modern Judaism. Why does Hillel matter? This gets back to that. The disciples of Hillel were gentle and modest and studied both their own opinions and the opinions of the other school, and humbly mentioned the words of the other school before their own. So it's this issue of what's important is that you hear the whole conversation. What's important is that you listen to both sides. And there's not a sort of absolute definitive answer. So this is, or I shouldn't say that. There are definitive answers, but they come in the midst of this conversation. And they come in the midst of debate. And they're always up for debate again. So that's those two major schools. And that's part of that culture of first century Jews, of the first century Hebrew faith. Right? And remember, we had these different groups. Now, I group Sadducees and Herodians together not because they're exactly the same, but because they depend upon something. And I think I've mentioned these last time. Right? So within first century Israel, first century Palestine, within this around Judea, Galilee, you have these different groups of Jews, and they're all hearkening back to that history that you read. They're all hearkening back to that Torah, that root, right? So the Sadducees and the Herodians, the reason I put them together is because both of them worked very hard to maintain a limited independence from Rome. What I mean by that, Rome is completely in control. But Herod is a kind of pretender to being a Jewish king, though he doesn't have great lineage. And he's certainly not devout in any sense of the word. He's not incredibly religiously devout. He's often hated by the Jews because he governs based on the power given to him, allotted to him by Roman conquerors. And often the Herodians live a very Greek lifestyle. They're not incredibly devout Jews. They just don't practice any kind of real Judaism. They're pragmatists and they seek power. The reason I put them alongside the Sadducees is because part of how they maintain their influence is through the building and protecting of the Jewish temple. The Sadducees, in all likelihood, hated the Herodians just like every other Jew, but they used them as a practical tool. Their relationship with the Herodians was to maintain their identity. For the Sadducees, a lot of them are connected to the priestly order, to the priestly line, the Levites. The Sadducees are from priestly families, and their central purpose is to maintain the temple, to maintain temple worship as the center of Jewish identity. Here's how we will maintain, here's how we'll survive. This is one of the questions that these different Jewish groups are asking. How do we survive? How do we keep our identity? How do we continue to be the people of God when God hasn't yet fulfilled all his promises to rescue us from these oppressors? So it's different answers to those questions. What it means to be God's people, when will God rescue us, will God rescue us, how will God rescue us, how do we relate to God right now while we're under oppression and under the power of the Romans? These are the questions that all these different groups are asking. For the Herodians, it's a pragmatist, self-interested thing. For the Sadducees, it's not pragmatic in the sense of self-interest. It's pragmatic in the sense of maintaining the cultural identity. The Sadducees are willing to lay their lives on the line and die for the temple. They're not warriors. They're not going to war. They're priests. But Sadducees are among those who are sometimes killed because they refuse to give way to Roman desires in order to protect the temple. But the Sadducees don't they're not really looking for much of a promised deliverance, not like the others. The core for the Sadducees and the priestly order seems to be, though there are exceptions, obviously. You'll see in the reading for the book of Luke that the father of John the Baptist, I think that's in Luke, to remember now, in the early Gospels, one of them, the father of John the Baptist, is from the priestly line. He's a priest. And he's obviously looking for the deliverance. So it's not to say that no priest is looking for deliverance from God, from the Romans, or by God from the Romans, or that every priest is a Sadducee. But the Sadducees are largely made up of priests, and their real core identity and value is we've got to maintain the temple. This is the heart of our Jewish identity. Whether they believe in a Messiah or not is in question. So there's the issue of this Messiah, right? This is the figure who's supposed to come and rescue his people. We couldn't read all this, but if we looked through the prophets and through the book of Daniel, we would see all these references to the Son of Man, or God's servant, or God's mighty right arm, or a king from the line of the tribe of Judah, from the line of David, a shoot that comes from the stump of David. That God's going to raise up a new king that will establish God's rule in Jerusalem over the whole world and suppress all these oppressors and bring everyone into the worship of the true God. This is the hope of many, many Jews at this time, probably most. It's not clear if that's the hope of the Sadducees. Their hope is that we maintain our identity by maintaining the temple. And in fact, many references say that they didn't believe in a resurrection. For most Jews, there's this idea that feeds into Christianity. The Christian understanding of resurrection, we'll talk about more, is integral to the Christian belief. It's a bodily resurrection. It's not just a spiritual persistence like in Hinduism or in many other belief systems. But that idea of bodily resurrection that's so important to Christianity comes out of this early Judaism. It's part and parcel of what it means to look for the Messiah, because the Messiah will bring about the resurrection of all the righteous. Everyone who's ever suffered wrongly, everyone who's ever been killed when they shouldn't have been, everyone who's ever died who was a righteous person will be resurrected to live under the perfect rule of God through his appointed Messiah. This is something that most Jews are looking for. So aside from the Sadducees and the Herodians, the rest of these schools are looking for that, and they have different answers to how that happens and who that is and what that will look like. The Zealots are rebels. They hate Rome. They look back on their ancient story, right? They look back on the stories of the judges, or Saul and David, right? And the people were oppressed by a foreign power, and what did God do? God raised up a leader, and what did that leader do? He took the sword and defeated the enemies of God and the enemies of the Jewish people. This is at the heart of the Zealots. They draw this from their history. We have to do that again. Just like the Maccabees overthrew the Greek rule. They suffered for it, but they regained some of our liberties from the Greeks. Just like Gideon defeated the Midianites in Judges, just like Joshua drove the pagans out of the land, just like David defeated Goliath and ran the Philistines out in their pagan ways. So God is going to raise up a Messiah to take up the sword and take up the cause of a suppressed people and set the world right and fix it. And fix it by military force. That's the Zealots. That's at the heart of their movement. If you're familiar with Easter, we're coming up on Easter here, right? If you're familiar with the Good Friday readings in many traditional Christian practices, you'll know that Pilate, when he's putting Jesus on trial for the crucifixion, Pilate offers to let a prisoner go because it's Passover. That's the tradition. We're going to let one prisoner go. And this prisoner that's offered up is Jesus, Yeshua, the one who's called the King of the Jews, the Messiah, according to some, or Barabbas. Barabbas means son of the Father. His first name is also, interestingly enough, Jesus or Yeshua. He's not just a petty thief. He was the leader of a zealot, violent movement. And in that process, he murdered someone. Probably he murdered either a Herodian, a tax collector, or perhaps a soldier. But he murdered someone that he saw as betraying Israel. He's not just some common crook. He is a zealot. And in a sense, you have two options, even in that trial, described in the Gospels, of what type of Messiah are the Jews looking for. Is it this Messiah that will take up the sword and defeat our enemies, or is it something other? So the Zealots are looking for that very clear, the Messiah will take up the sword and defeat our enemies. The Essenes are a group that we'll look at a little more closely, briefly in just a minute. They are looking for the sense of, we have to make ourselves completely pure and holy. Otherwise, the Messiah will not come. So we'll come back to that. They don't play a large role in the New Testament because they're actually outside of the cities. They go out in like these monastic, secluded communities of sorts. The Pharisees, if you're familiar with the New Testament, you'll read much about confrontation between Jesus and his followers and the Pharisees. The reason for that is because they, in a sense, had the most in common. They're not ready to take up arms and try to defeat Rome because it's really kind of a lost cause. They expect the Messiah to come and do that. And when he comes, they expect to know him. But their focus is on the teachings of the Torah and the teachings of the elders. The Pharisees are not rooted. They appreciate the temple. They worship in the temple. The temple is important. But temples have been destroyed before, and they can be destroyed again. So for the Pharisees, the key is the Torah, the law, the Mishnahs, the teachings of the elders, those oral traditions passed down. They believe, many Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection at all, or angels. The Pharisees believe many things that Christians will also share and believe. A resurrection, bodily resurrection brought about by the Messiah. Pharisees believe in angels. They believe that a Messiah is coming to set them free. But that what's essential is that we maintain proper synagogue worship and Torah interpretation, and we preserve the Mishnahs and this kind of idea of the oral Torah passed down from the elders. Christians were first called Nazarenes. They weren't called Christians until probably, 20 years or so after the events around Jesus in Jerusalem. They're first called Christians in Antioch. But they're called the Nazarenes based on the fact that Jesus hails from Nazareth. So these early Christians, they too value the scriptures. When you read the New Testament, the writers are going to say, this according to the scriptures, or Jesus did that according to the prophets, or you should behave this way according to the scriptures, or Christ came to free us from our sins according to the scriptures. They, like the Pharisees, look back to, like the Essenes, like the Zealots, they look back to their history, but they draw on it differently. This is key to understanding this formation of these two faiths. What we know of the Essenes comes from a find at Qumran. This isn't incredibly essential to modern Judaism, but it's interesting to note. Along the Dead Sea, there was this settlement dug up, and there we found what's called the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are prophetic writings, oftentimes Isaiah, Daniel, but also some other writings that we didn't have, having many of them focused on this key Messiah figure. And we found those there that seem to be central. And another thing that was key part of this Qumran community is these mikvahs, these ceremonial baths. that were central to their practice. And for the Essenes, this Qumran movement, the key was to purify yourself daily, to engulf yourself in the scriptures and to purify yourself bodily with water. Because when you became pure enough, when you understood the scriptures well enough, when you were transformed enough, then the Messiah would come. They don't see the temple as being pure or good. They see the temple as a false temple. But they seclude themselves from the society. And they're rooted in this kind of cleansing rituals and prophetic, apocalyptic sort of scriptural tradition. Some scholars have tried to connect John the Baptist to the Qumran sect, but his approach is different. He's not in a secluded community bathing himself daily. He has this interesting take on this where he baptizes people for the forgiveness of their sins. It's like a one-time thing. That's not what Qumran is doing. There's obviously similarity. The similarity comes from a shared root, in that there is a sense of purification involved with Jewish worship. There's a sense of a symbolic purification in washing, and this is important. But that doesn't mean that John the Baptist came from Qumran or was an Essene. It means that they both are drawing on similar sources in their Hebrew Jewish scriptural history. So what's going on, you'll read in the New Testament, is kind of a prophetic critique. And this ongoing infighting between two groups of what it means to be Jewish. And so a lot of it takes place over the Sabbath. We see Jesus conflicting with the Pharisees and others over the proper practice of the Sabbath. And this is one story of that. You can kind of read through it. But essentially, Jesus' disciples are on the Sabbath. They're walking. They pass a grain field. And they just pick some grain and start rubbing it with their hands so they can eat it. They have to get the outer hulls off of it to eat it. And the Pharisees are very critical of this, right? And this is really presented in an almost humorous way. Like it's like the disciples were walking along, they pick this grain, and what the Pharisees just pop out of the field. I mean, it's not clear, but you get this kind of humorous sense to it that they're trying to find, is this really the right type of Messiah? This person, Jesus, and his followers, what are they doing? And Jesus isn't saying the scriptures don't matter. He's not saying the Sabbath doesn't matter. What he's saying is you have to interpret, you have to read through the proper lens. And if you were reading through the proper lens, you would understand that this is perfectly fine. To do good on the Sabbath is a good thing. And so it's a key fight. Now, why is this such a serious issue? Well, think of the generations of captivity, oppression, persecution that the Jews have suffered. And they see it as having been suffered because they haven't obeyed this. This is out of Deuteronomy. This is called the Shema. And the Shema says, "Hear," it's literally the word "hear." Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. This is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. This is, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind." Okay, so this idea, this is the kind of summation of the whole Jewish law. And it's this statement against all forms of idolatry and the worship of anything else. And so these Jews understand themselves as having, we are now suffering because for generations we were idolatrous, and we've had to suffer for generations. And so this is a key concept. The Essenes are doing this, the Pharisees are doing this, right? They're looking for, how do we properly keep this law so that God will rescue us again? But it's disobedience that they understand as having gotten them into this situation in the first place. Right? And here again, the importance of passing on this law to your family. This is a key, familial passing along of these traditions and of this faith, of these practices is so central to even modern Judaism. But this is kind of the admonition of Deuteronomy. You have to keep this law. You have to pass it on to your children. You can't allow for idolatry. That's why we're in the shape we're in. When we repent, when we truly repent, that's when God will rescue us. This is the belief of the Essenes. This is the belief of the Pharisees, practiced in a different way. But this is a serious issue. So when other Jews start doing things that they think, you're breaking the laws, it's not just that you're hurting yourself. It's not, you might go to hell or something. It's not this very private religious thing. You impact the whole nation. You impact the whole people. You must behave right. You can't teach wrong things. It will pull people into idolatry. It will cause people to disobey. So this is the conflict for the Pharisees. The conflict for the Sadducees that you sometimes see with Jesus is over, Jesus, you sound somewhat political. You might get the temple destroyed. Which is why it's such a big deal at one point when Jesus says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll build it up again. It's a conflict with the temple. It's a conflict with the Pharisaical interpretation of the Torah. There are these conflicts, these inner conflicts. And this is all a Jewish movement. This isn't Jews versus Gentiles, Christians versus Jews. This is coming from within the Jewish heritage. How do we properly fulfill these scriptures? How does that work? And Jesus, first and foremost, is a prophetic critique of what the Pharisees are doing. He's basically saying, you're not doing it right because you focus on little tiny things, but you don't focus on the real big things that matter. You find some little loophole in the Mishnah or in the Gemara, within these commentaries, teachings of the rabbis, and you work your way through the law. Meanwhile, you let it come crashing down on the head of some poor soul who doesn't have that understanding. And so Jesus comes as a very prophetic figure against what he sees as internal conflict and internal oppression and the internal hurting of fellow Jews. The failure to understand compassion as at the heart of God's character and the heart of God's law. This is part of the message. A lot of times, Western people from a Christian background will have this sense of the Pharisees are legalists and the Christians are all about, compassion and not being legalistic. It's a really poor description of it. It is much more an issue of interpretation. What is God doing? How is he doing it? Jesus says some things that could be considered incredibly legalistic, right? If you don't forgive someone else what they do to you, God will not forgive you. That's a pretty severe statement, right? If you cause one of these little ones to sin, you're worthy to have a millstone. Okay, millstone is like huge, tied around you and be cast into the sea. That's pretty heavy, right? Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. These are all sayings of Jesus. So you can't just look at this debate within this internal debate within this first century Judaism as an issue of somebody wanting to be more legalistic and someone wanting to be more gracious. But it is rooted in interpretation. What does it mean to be compassionate and merciful? What is the goal of God? What is the wisdom of God? How do we interpret the Torah? How do we apply the Torah? What's the essence of the Torah? And Jesus says it's to love the Lord your God. He quotes that passage from Deuteronomy, right? Jesus also says the second is like to it, love your neighbor as yourself. But there's more to what's going on between the Pharisees and Jesus movement than simply legalism versus not legalism. It is a rich and deep question of how do we interpret what the Messiah will be like, what the Messiah will do. When will the resurrection come? How will deliverance from Rome appear to us? These are the questions. And so the issue with the Pharisees is Jesus the Messiah? And there are things about him that they think he's not the right Messiah. And that's the issue. Jesus at some points even says, unless you hate mother, father, sister, brother, wife, children, even your own flesh, you cannot be my disciple. This is a pretty severe statement. It's calling for a very absolute sort of loyalty to this messianic figure, this priestly king of God who is to be the ruler of the whole world. That's the message of Christianity. This priestly king Messiah figure, Jesus, is what rabbinic Judaism rejects. That's the conversation that's going on. And it's a serious conversation, again, because what? We've suffered as a people for generations because we didn't get it right last time. The last time we had a chance, and the time before that we had a chance, we didn't get it right, so we've been suffering for decades now, maybe even centuries. We've been oppressed, we've been persecuted because we didn't keep the law of God. But Jesus is saying your way out is not the way out. You need to see that you're part of that movement that squelches the prophets because it affects your status quo, because it doesn't line up with your interpretation. And so this is a pretty severe, and this passage actually gets abused much later in the history between Jews and Christians, right? From the foundation of the world, the blood of all the prophets, from Abel to the Zechariah, will be on you. There have been, sadly, Christians at certain points in history that use that to say, so we have a right to persecute Jews. That isn't in line with what Jesus is saying, nor is it in line with the early church, who thrived on the idea of love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, bless those who curse you. This was central to Jesus' teaching, and when we look at the early church, this was central to their action. It's not till much later that you begin to see certain segments of Christianized societies persecuting Jews based on this passage. But this passage itself is not an instance of an outside force persecuting and calling for the death of Jews or anything like that. So we have to be careful not to read backwards through thousands of years of history and understand this is an inter-religious conflict, or intra, I should say. It's between one group of Jews and another. So when we see passages like this, we can't simply read them through the lens of the Holocaust and the pogroms and all those types of things that happened in the Middle Ages. We have to read them first and foremost as between Jew and Jew, a discussion of how to be God's people, who are the true Jews. And I have a little recent video that kind of delves into that you'll watch as well. And the discussion and the insults and the harshness of discussion can go both ways. We see Jesus in the Talmud early on, particularly the Babylonian Talmud, because they're not under Roman rule. They're under the Persians. So Christianity doesn't have the influence in the mid-hundreds, 300, 400, 500, the Common Era after Jesus, right? So Jesus in the Talmud is seen in very harsh ways. One Talmudic passage puts Jesus in hell, boiling in his own excrement. Another Talmudic passage puts Jesus as a illegitimate son of an affair between Mary and a Roman soldier named Pantera, who goes to a teacher and gets angry at his teacher and sets up a brick and worships it. There are other Talmudic passages that offer counter arguments and counter discussions for the death of Jesus. They move it away from the crucifixion as reported in the Gospels. There are other Talmud passages that say it's better to die of a sickness than to have some Christian pray for you and you get well. There are Talmudic passages that essentially say that it goes into, sorry, I lost that one. But the Talmud does not look positively on Jesus or the Jesus movement, especially the Babylonian Talmud. The other one I was going to say is, at one point in the narrative of Jesus, actually at a couple of points in the various Gospels, you get this where people surrounding Jesus will hear this voice from heaven declare, this is my beloved Son, whom I'm well pleased, or this is my beloved Son, do what he says, or something along those lines. And it's this voice from heaven. There are actually later Talmudic stories of teachers in conflict, and a voice comes from heaven on the side of one who nonetheless in the story is wrong. And so the Talmud story, the Mishnahs and the Gemara go on to say, he was wrong because not even a voice from heaven can counter the Torah and the Mishnahs, the oral Torah passed down from the elders. So there's real clear internal battle over what it means to be Jewish. Historically, there have been various perspectives on this. Jacob and Esau. Paul uses this one, but the Jews use it in the opposite way. The non-Nazarene, the non-Christian Jews see Edom as Rome. Rome, especially later on, once Rome is kind of Christianized. So Rome is Esau. They're the son that's evil and broken and doesn't think of spiritual things. They see themselves as Jacob or Israel. Paul uses this in the book of Romans. He talks about, Jacob have I loved and Esau, and the church is the continuation of the line, the people of faith, the people of calling. The same happens with Isaac and Ishmael. Others are seen as Ishmael. This also applies to Jewish and Muslim understanding, this debate between the brothers, the sons of Abraham. Isaac is but the Christians use this as well. Paul says, the church is the people of faith. They're the children of faith, not just the children of the flesh. So they're the Isaac versus those who don't follow the Messiah are the Ishmaels. So these are some kind of ongoing discussions, and they take various forms and various come in various contexts. But this persists from both sides of this divide. So that's something to keep in mind. This is an internal Jewish debate at the beginning. It spreads to become something more, but it is really about who are God's people. So what we have today is Rabbinic Judaism. With the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the Sadducees pretty much go away. I mean, there's no temple for them to protect their understanding. You have a few more uprisings until about 150 AD, and the Bar Kokhba revolt, I think it happens around 150, and that's one of the last revolts against Rome, and it ends in just tragic death for those who are attempting it. But Bar Kokhba claims this kind of messianic role, and then he's killed. His followers are slaughtered. So that kind of ends the physical military uprisings. That was the last one. There's no sense that we're going to rebuild the temple and go back to Jerusalem and take militarily. So the Sadducees are gone. The Herodians have been removed from their power. The temple's gone. The Essenes, when you have a very elitist, private faith, it doesn't spread much, and so it pretty much disappears. There may be some minor remainders of them somewhere out there in the world, just like occasionally they'll have these kind of Sadducee-like groups come up, but primary expressions of Judaism today are Rabbinic Judaism, which is rooted in the Pharisees. This Torah, Mishnah, teachings of the elders, the importance of keeping our identity wrapped up in the teachings of the elders and the schools of the rabbis. This is the shoot that grows from the Pharisees at Jesus' time, and that's where we get Rabbinic Judaism. That's the roots of it, at least in their self-understanding, and for many scholars, it's debated, but for simple use, there's a correlation there. There's a definite connection in modern Rabbinic Judaism, going back to the Pharisees, to the Talmud, to the Mishnahs. This is important to understand. Jewish practice today, we'll look at some things, but it has to do with the Sabbath and the holy days, the family ties, the Passover, the Day of Atonement. These are central. Like that opening passage, right? It's about cultural practice and connection to kind of this cultural identity maintained through these practices, not about a specific belief about God, or even necessarily a specific belief about the scriptures, but a belief, a practice in maintaining something of the culture passed down from the rabbis. So that's the root of Judaism today, and why it's sometimes hard to define, because it's not always religious in the sense that we think of as religious, because it's not always theology based. It's very much practice based and identity based. Though there are some Jewish theologians that look more at the theology, but we'll touch on that more later.